am Jeffe Kennedy. I live up in Santa Fe. I am the current president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association. I was just re-elected for 2 more years, actually. So
a brave woman and a fool.
The competition was really tough.
It was tough. It was a tight race. I write epic fantasy romance, or as the kids are calling it these days, romantasy. And,
I like that.
I am just about to publish my 64th title.
Wow. Wow.
So I am Emily Mah. I had most of my publishing success and made most of my money in chick lit as E.M. Tippett. But I've been in science fiction. That's, what I went to workshops for and such starting out. I am from Los Alamos originally. I live up in New Mexico, or up in Santa Fe. Yes, I live in New Mexico as well. So I'm a vegetarian, and I haven't had a whole lot of food at this. So my blood sugar's a little low.
Do any of you have any food?
I live up in Santa Fe.
Okay. Hi, I'm Connie Willis, and I have been writing science fiction since the late Cretaceous. A lot of it has been time travel to the actual past, like Doomsday Book and To Say Nothing of the Dog. Just finished a new novel called The Road to Roswell, which is a comic abduction novel. Of course it's comic. What else could it be? It's the alien abduction.
Yes.
And but I love writing all kinds of things. And I have been the Toastmaster for this lectureship for many years. And love Jack Williamson, and was lucky to be able to call myself a friend of Jack Williamson's.
I'm Jon Williams. Let's see, I think last time I added it up, I had written 43 novels of fiction, mostly science fiction, some fantasy. And during the course of that, I've done my share of world building. So I've written a few near contemporary novels, which take place in a world you would very much recognize as your own. But I'm also a fan of far future fiction, where, with any luck, you are creating a world that is utterly transformed from the one that we live in. And I've also written a fantasy series beginning with Metropolitan, which was so solid and well thought out that most readers thought it was science fiction. And I kept saying, but it has magic in it. It has, people who call themselves mages and they're doing magic. And they said, yes, but it's got flying cars and computers. So, which one of these don't we have now? Anyway, the flying cars. But anyway, so that's me.
Our moderators are, yay! We're saved.
The cookies needed to be rescued.
Oh,
Okay.
got it.
So it sounds like we've begun.
Yep.
So I think the best question to start this off from is, when you're world building, what's the first thing you think? Character or location?
Does oh shit, I've got to build a world count?
That works as an answer too.
Good answer.
Yeah. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about, what our other backgrounds are that we bring into the. So you want to start, Darynda?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Oh, yeah, sure. My background is vast. I don't have a my background is my imagination.
Well, you draw on New Mexico for your
I
world
do.
building a lot.
You're fluent in sign language. Come on.
I do. I have a degree in sign language interpretation. And believe it or not, it does come into play.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. So as far as that goes, I would think what I think of first is maybe the rules that I just want to kind of follow. I mean, it kind of happens organically. World building. So I don't know.
Sue is not my middle name. Let's see. So when I start, I always start with character and situation. And when I first started out, I did it pretty organically. Bringing in Emily's question, I am trained as a scientist, and so I have a graduate degree in neurobiology, and so I think in terms of physiology, and I also think in terms of ecology and the physical environment, because where I got my degree was in a wildlife department as well. It was up in Wyoming, so they spliced them. So I used to like sort of ride around in my characters' heads and discover the world as they did. And over time, I've gotten more methodical about it. And I think about it in terms of, because I start with like character and situation, I've started building the world to make my protagonists' lives as difficult as possible. So I start creating I guess, largely the social structure that will prevent them from getting what they want.
So my undergraduate was in philosophy, politics, and economics, and then I'm a recovering attorney, and then went to law school after that. And I've done a lot of different things. Now I work in the compliance department of a financial firm, and I'm still kind of finding out what that is. Apparently, according to the tests, I'm like really qualified for it. So, okay, I'm doing that. To me, the most interesting parts of world building are people don't realize that pretty much anything that you study can be leveraged into world building. So a lot of people don't realize if you want to do a good magic system, study economics. You know, a lot of people, you would do a cool idea of a world, study history, but almost anything you can start to leverage into, like, well, what if I take this one thing and build out from it. And I usually try to focus on, having been an attorney and also working in financial advisory, who is the world not working for? What are the rules that keep some people out? Because your most interesting characters are the people for whom the world is not working for.
Okay. Yeah, I'm an English major who loves history, and my novels almost always draw on what you call real history and the real past. My time travel takes place in the real past, but I say that with air quotes because even though you're writing, that's the real past as opposed to, say, a made-up past, or a made-up world where you've invented a whole planet or you've invented a whole magic structure or something. However, the idea that this is somehow realer than those worlds is totally a false one. People are always saying, I want to go back to Dickens' England. There is no Dickens' England. Dickens made it up. He drew on certain aspects of Victorian society. But if you went to the past, you would not find Dickens' past, because that was an intensely personal past. He was looking at specific instances, specific situations, and he was putting his own sensibility into them. So I feel that what I do is exactly the same as what people do when they're making up a planet, or they're making up a history, a fake history, like in Dune, for instance. And I am always interested, I think, because the reason I love history is because of the people in history and the endless, ridiculous ways they behave. That I always,
today.
so glad that's over when everyone is totally sensible. And so I'm when I go to world building, that's what I'm always looking at. When I wrote one of my books had the Titanic in it, and I was not interested in how the Titanic was constructed, although that did turn out to be quite important, and or what the socioeconomics of first and second and third classes were. I was interested in the individual behavior of the people who were on the Titanic that night, and how unexpected their behavior was in almost every instance. People able to rise to incredible levels of bravery that you can't imagine yourself rising to, and then people at the same time displaying intense cowardice and intense stupidity.
That book. I don't know if I ever told you that.
Thank you.
I really loved it.
Thank you. How nice. Thank you. So anyway, I think all of these things figure in to world building, and you just have to find your own approach.
I have a couple approaches to world building, and it depends on whether the character comes first or the world comes first. And if the character comes first, I build the world around the character and create stressors so that this character is under stress for the whole narrative, and you find out what he or she is made of. Sometimes I build the world first, as in, say, Aristoi or my Metropolitan, and what I want to do in that case is to give my character a lot of social mobility so that he or she can travel through all of the levels of this world and show them to the reader.
Right. Yeah.
But also I liked Emily's idea of finding the person who doesn't fit in, because I do that quite often too. And if you,
And it's all
you,
of us.
You
I
can
mean, it
create,
can-
well,
to a
you know,
certain
you
degree.
create a utopia, and then you write about the one person who doesn't fit into utopia.
Right.
You know?
Right.
and
Don't
to
write
follow-
about happy people. They're going to be boring stories.
And to follow up on something that Connie said that I think is really important is no matter what genre you're writing a story in, you're going to be building a world.
Yes.
Because even if you're writing something that is set in absolutely our modern day contemporary society, you're still having to pick and choose which details you're going to show, and those should serve the story because you can't replicate the complexity of the actual world. So
Right.
you're always world building.
Right. So Bridget Jones's Diary and Bright Lights, Big City are both set in metropolitan world of today. Only they could not be more different.
Right.
You know, yeah.
So when you're building the world, what kind of traps or uh-ohs do you put in? How do you craft that for the character that is the main protagonist of your narrative?
What are the main fails to avoid? Is kind of what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay.
Since you understand the question, why don't you answer?
I think the important thing is writing is an iterative process, and most world building fails because it's too simple. Everybody thinks this. Well, there's a lot of shades to whatever this is. You know, there's a lot of shades of gray, even to what something that looks pretty darn dark gray or pretty darn white or or whatever. And understanding that as you are writing, you're probably going to have to go back and layer in like, okay, well now I've just realized from the way this character's talking that this character's from a family that has an attitude like this. Okay, well what would start an attitude like that? And you can sort of start just putting in the foreshadowing for that. That's how I at least build out the world and give it those levels and depth.
Yeah, one of the main problems I see in people's world building is the stuff that you don't leave out. You need to leave out a lot of stuff.
Yes.
You need to figure it all out, and maybe you even need, depending on who you are, to write it all down. But then you need to cross it all out and just leave a very small iceberg-like potential above the waterline. Because I don't, you've all read books where it's set in the Middle Ages, and so they give you this 32-page description of a weaving in the Middle Ages. No one cares about weaving in the Middle Ages except the person who wrote the book.
Who had to research it clearly.
And the person who had to research it. And the attitude seems to be, by God, I had to do all this homework, and now you're going to read it. Okay? And so don't do that to your reader. You need to have a hint of all the hard work you did, and a hint of all the stuff that, if you just hint at the world rather than showing the whole thing, I think.
So one thing that I could think of that I have learned to do after this many books, which took me way too long to figure out, is not to set a hard and fast rule or detail where I don't need to. Because
Leave it vague.
Leave it vague, because it will come back to bite you
Correct.
in the rear at some
So
point.
correct.
And so, I was revising this book this morning, and that I'm way behind on, and I had a note to myself to check on something. So it was like the protagonist, when she had learned to do this when her grandmother taught her to pick herbs. And I had a note to myself saying, check on this, because I couldn't remember what I'd said about this woman's grandmother and this kind of thing, because it's 5th book and 9. And I, coming back on this, upon sober reflection, I was like, why does it matter? It doesn't matter. And so I just changed the line to say, when she learned to pick herbs. And that way I am
Yep.
not tied into anything.
Yeah, the case, and you have a grandmother that might have died before she was born, or something like that.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And
Right.
so those kinds of things, and it's always a toss-off line.
Yes.
It's always something that you had no need to be.
But a reader will catch it.
Yes.
Every time.
And they will
I had-
tell you.
And I had one line in one book, and I said something like, there was a baby blanket, and it may have been blue, something like that, because I couldn't remember the color. Why did I even put the color? Well,
Because it didn't matter.
It did not matter. Well, I had a reader write me a scathing letter saying, that like it was yellow. We'll never read you again.
That's right.
And this was literally like 6 books before that one, you know? And I'm like, really? Was it that important? I didn't actually say it was blue. I said she thought it was blue. Anyway, it was the wrong thing to do.
It's true. Yeah, one of my first fan letters that I ever got was for a story in which this woman was rescuing spaceships with her mind, so you can see how scientifically accurate it was. But she couldn't do it while sitting in a chair. She had to do it while the rest of her mind was kind of occupied. So she would do household chores. So she did the dishes and she vacuumed. And then at one point she cleaned behind the couch where she found 37 pencils, 94 cents, and the molasses swamp card to the Candyland game. And I got this furious letter. There is no molasses swamp card in the Candyland game. There is a molasses swamp, but there is no card. I will never read you again. Not only did it not matter, it didn't have anything to do with the story. It was just a detail in the story. So yeah.
I think that that you can have a lot of fun with things that don't matter.
Well, that's true. That is
the
true.
Fantasy series Quillifer that I wrote is set in a kind of fantasy version of the Northern European Renaissance. And just in researching it, I just found all this wonderful stuff that I couldn't resist, like turnspit dogs. Do you know about turnspit dogs?
You're about to learn about turnspit dogs.
Yes. They were a breed of dog now extinct. The last one died in the mid-1800s, I think, and is stuffed and in a museum. But anyway, they would run in what is basically a giant hamster wheel. And this would be connected up to a belt system, which would turn the spit, because they were, back in those days, there weren't a lot of ovens around, so it was all open spit.
Right.
Over an open hearth. And that was just such a wonderful detail that I could insert into a scene and sort of light up the reader's mind. And it had nothing to do with the story, really.
Right.
Well, it's a delicate line to walk.
Yeah.
And Connie gives a great talk on this too, about that, sort of the saying, God is in the details, right?
Right.
That the details are what elevate and illuminate the story, but you have to
Be careful.
Be careful.
You just have to be careful. Yeah.
And I also like to use, I use history a lot because I was a double history English major. But I have learned to manipulate the expectations of readers who know the history so that I can continually disappoint them and thwart them in every possible way.
And they will write you a letter saying, I'm never going to read you again.
Well, and you also kind of need to understand what it is, why you're building the world that you are, and focus on the aspects of that world. So, for example, the Expanse books, you guys know the Expanse books, they put a lot of effort into the politics and the economics and, how you get the debt off of Ceres when when everything goes down. And they will not name a year that this occurs because they don't want to have to figure out what is near what. How long it would take to fly from Mars to Ceres in some particular year. Because there's people who know this kind of stuff. And it takes you down a rabbit hole. You don't want to say, we got to completely rewrite book 6 because it actually takes 9 months from Mars to Earth, and because we earlier said that the drives go this fast or things like that. And it's not cheating to not have to hammer out the details that really are not don't really have to do with the story you're trying to tell.
Right.
and don't illuminate it.
I mean, asteroids will really mess up your chronology.
Yeah.
Because I've tried it, and
Especially if they hit Earth.
Yeah.
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 Let's see. If you do find yourself in a situation where someone's either called you on something or you're going over a final look at a book and you find a problem, do you write yourself out of that problem by fixing the world or changing something with the character?
Or killing the person who wrote you the letter. Yeah.
That's not legal, Connie.
I know.
As a former attorney.
I know, but
Well,
only if
would
it
it be legal
were.
if you put in the beginning of the book any any similarity to a person living or dead is completely.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a
Any
broad
similarity to
caveat.
logic or reason or the actual facts is
This
not
biographical,
necessary.
this biographical film has that, at the end, it's like, okay, sure. Yeah.
So I had one like this. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was just say, if you can catch it before you actually turn the book in.
Oh, yeah, then you're golden.
You're gold, yeah, that's perfect, so.
Yeah, usually you get these
But
letters
usually
after
that's
publication.
Yeah. So I found one that was in book 3 of a trilogy. And again, it was this stupid thing where I had a toss-off line that I didn't have to have there in the first place in the first book. And it totally messed up because I'm a Write for Discovery author, I'm a gardener. I cannot pre-plot to save my life. So I don't know how the trilogy is going to end. And by the time I got to the end of this trilogy, I had this one toss-off line by my protagonist in the book 1 that would ruin everything. And so I just had her say that she lied.
Oh, good. Lying
Well, she was a really good liar, so it was within character.
Yeah,
But she's
right.
like, yeah, I lied about that. You were my enemy. Why would I have told you the truth?
It is really, we've all been laughing about it, but when I was close to the end of Doomsday, I was almost done with the book. And a lot of it takes place in a future Oxford and then in medieval times. And so the medieval times were operating on, I always get this wrong, but one of them was operating on the Julian calendar and the other was operating on the Gregorian, and there's 2 weeks difference. And I had looked it all up to begin with to make sure which one was later and which one was earlier, and I thought all the dates, I had plots, I had, calendars, I had
Charts,
I had everything. And, but then like 2 weeks before, I woke up in the middle of the night and I was convinced that I had gotten it backwards and that everything in fact should be 2 weeks earlier instead of 2 weeks later. And I literally got up out of bed to look it up in the encyclopedia. Those were encyclopedia days. And just go, because I was like, I'm going to have to rewrite the entire book if
Right.
this is the case. And it was real important. So I would have in fact had to rewrite the entire book. But luckily, I had got it right in the first place. But sometimes these things really do screw you up, and they do matter. And the trick is figuring out how they matter and if they matter, and then making sure that everything is right that you care about.
Yeah,
And then
go ahead.
sorry, I was going to say 2 ancillary points is, and these things happen even in very well established, Harry Potter. What book was it when she was like, oh, dang, wizards are adults at 17, because she was like, oh, he's 11 and I'm going to write 7 books, and so he's going to be adult at the end of it. Without thinking, you're writing 11 as 1. He's only going to be 17 at the end of it. So this is not like, it's unforgivable thing or a thing that doesn't happen. And the second thing is, there is also something to be said for never let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Yeah.
People getting so upset that Titanic was inaccurate that everybody in the lifeboats made it when a lot of lifeboats actually got sucked down. I'm sorry, if you got people yelling at you about that, you have won. You made them look.
I was one of those people who my family would not sit with me at Titanic. They
Yes.
made me
Oh,
sit
you
3
knew
rows
too much.
back.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But if you are a writer, people will not sit with you in movies
Well,
because
that's
they're like,
true.
just
That
you
is
just
true.
shut up.
Because you're like, oh, this is going to happen.
Yeah.
Watch.
I was so furious at all the mistakes in Titanic. I cannot tell you. Because they cared, and it was a classic example of caring about the wrong stuff.
Right.
That Cameron went on TV and bragged about how he had found the same carpet company to weave exactly the same carpet that was on the steps of the grand staircase. And I'm like, you spent all this time in the fucking carpet, and you didn't spend any time on what really happened on the Titanic. What is the matter with you?
He's an oceanographer.
He's an oceanographer. Too bad.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you as a writer and then you have to figure out what your audience thinks you're writing about, and then what you have to figure out what you're writing about, and then you'll be able to determine the difference between non-essential and essential things that you get right.
Yeah,
seeing your
I
hands,
once,
if you want.
I found that sometimes you can do exemplary research and it will lead you totally astray.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
I wrote a space opera once with some of the technical details based on a 12-year-old astronomy text.
Oh.
Yeah.
During those 12 years, the entire universe changed. And nobody told me.
This was pre-internet.
Yeah. Oh, the internet is reliable.
The internet had not developed to the...
It was Yahoo and dial-up and
Yeah,
murder a
right,
robot to
yeah,
get
right,
online. And,
yeah.
But even the internet is full of terrible,
I
terrible
knew
things.
better than to trust the internet. I mean, this was a textbook.
Terrible mistakes.
What? You mean doesn't have completely accurate information.
I know it's a shock. I know
Okay,
it's
I
a
think
shock.
at this point, we're going to open it up to questions, and I see Tracy.
Tracy. Question about something. How do you determine what should be left?
Fundamentally, you have to decide what story are you telling. And, I think everybody here is going to come tell you a different way to come at what is the story that you're telling. For me, it's what is it that has this nagging at my mind? Like, what is going to scratch that itch to make me feel like that story's been told? But
Do you get stuck ever, like,
Never. We never get stuck.
you want to see how many
Never.
partial manuscripts I've got on?
We never get stuck.
Yeah.
I've been working on a sci-fi piece short story for a while, and it's the characters go to Mars, and something I've been really stuck on is an appropriate propulsion system to Mars.
Yeah.
I have done online research and such, but how debating how detailed do I really need to get with that, but, do I just kind of describe it generally, or do I really need to go into some of the...
Well, how long do you plan to spend on the journey? That's
Yeah,
another thing.
that's the time I did a short story. They did nuclear pulse propulsion because that shows you the kind of people that are on this ship. That is a very difficult way to travel. You are on crash couches, you can break bones. It's a very different story than Star Trek, but
I think Walter's point is a good one.
Yeah.
It's like how much time
Yeah.
keep going with that, Walter.
Yeah, if you want your characters to have to spend 2.5 hours in each other's armpits flying out to Mars, 2.5 years, I'm sorry, not hours. Yeah. Then you got chemical rockets, and then somewhere in the middle there's an ion engine, and then nuclear pulse propulsion.
nuclear pulse propulsion is insane.
Yeah, which is just the most 1950s thing I can think of, honestly.
It's still a thing.
Yeah.
I think one of the most important things is you have to figure out what your story is about. I've told this story before, but the legend is that when they were writing Casablanca, they were already filming. They couldn't decide on the ending. Ingrid Bergman kept asking, "Who am I in love with?" They couldn't give her an answer, and they were getting new pages every day. It was just a nightmare. And finally, the last two screenwriters out of like 12 who had tried before were driving to the studio, and they slammed on the brakes. Driver slammed on the brakes in the middle of the avenue, Sepulveda, yeah, and said, "I've got it. This isn't a love story. This is a story about a man who lost his faith, who gets it back." And they said, "Oh, you're right. And that means she's in love with both of them. And that means this." And everything fell into place once they figured out what the story was about. The idea that writers know what their own story is about is a myth.
Oh, yes.
It's something they have to figure out. And it's really hard to figure out. You think you're writing this adventure, and then it turns out that you made all these promises to the reader or the audience, and you didn't realize you made them. And you have to figure out what the story is actually about. And because once you do, you'll know that you've got it, because then everything else will fall into place.
Yeah. Now, I think when you're talking about the drive systems, you're obsessing about the wrong thing.
Yeah.
You're putting the carpet down on the grand staircase.
Right. Forget the
So-
Come
carpet.
up with something and send it off, and editors or whomever looking at it, that's completely ridiculous.
I mean, don't use a gas combustion engine. Just avoid the obvious, yeah.
Get the story written.
Well, ever seen Alphaville, the science fiction mystery in which the detective gets in his Ford Galaxy and flies off to other planets? And it's like a 1965 Ford Galaxy.
It's interesting, slightly tangential to this, but right before this panel started, Darynda and I were sitting with Rebecca Roanhorse, and we were trading stories of how we got started writing, like our first sale and all that sort of thing. And very interestingly, all three of us had no idea what genre we were writing when we sold our books, that it ended up being the publisher telling us, "Oh, we're going to call it this." And so I think that's really important, because you hear a lot from the publishing people. They're always like, "Well, it's very important for you to know what genre you're writing." And writers never know.
No, right.
And won't even necessarily agree with our publishers. It's like, okay, you can
fine.
market it like that.
Is that what you want to call it?
Yeah, I agree.
And
I agree.
your question?
Do you ever get scared or nervous that your world
Well, the saying goes, good writers borrow, great writers steal.
Steal.
And also, we are rich because we steal from the best houses.
Yes.
That's my favorite.
Right. You cannot write a story like there were a series of letters written to Gardner Dozois when he was an editor, and there was one writer who kept saying, I wrote this story and it's actually about Mars, but it's okay because I changed the planet's name to Cars. You can't do that.
Practice filing the serial numbers off.
Don't do that. But anything else, you can't worry about it. The fact that you're putting yourself into the story will make it unique, and no, you can't write, everybody who grew up with Star Wars is influenced by Star Wars. Everybody who grew up with, I don't know. Tolkien is influenced by Tolkien, but it doesn't matter, nah.
If you think something is too identical, change it. Change it more than Mars to Cars. But actually change it. If you think, okay, maybe orcs makes this too much like Tolkien, then make it another kind of creature that is orc-like.
Well, and even that's an itch. Like, why do you not want it to be like Tolkien in that way?
Right.
Because no matter how brilliant any of you are, and there are probably people as brilliant as Tolkien in this room, you are not Tolkien. You can try. You will not be Tolkien. You will be yourself, whether you want to be or not.
Okay, and there was a question in the back.
Yeah, he had asked a question about, building traps for your reader. How many traps is too much?
So what do you mean by traps for the reader? I don't understand.
They mean like torturing the reader. I mean, torturing you mean for the reader or your characters?
For the reader itself.
Oh.
So that what Walter was saying.
Yeah.
About, yeah.
The question would be more for
Walter is mean. He is not nice. He does tabletop gaming, and he is
Okay,
mean.
I still don't understand what a trap for a reader is. Can you articulate it?
Well, I'm not. Well, I think what you're doing is you're leading the reader astray.
Yeah.
Which is what every good detective writer does,
okay,
right?
okay.
You want the reader to be thinking about who did it and to get it wrong and have the brilliant detective come in at the end.
Right.
and scream.
Is that what
So-
you mean?
Right.
Yes, but how many times can you do that without it being too much for the reader?
Well,
Depends on
Agatha
your-
Christie
yeah.
did it through 50 novels and an entire career, and sometimes she did the exact same trick over again.
Or
And
she revealed a trick in a novel before.
in the novel before.
Or there's what would be really hard to solve is if like a group of people did this, and then the next
Right.
novel would be that, and you still wouldn't see it, and you're just like, great.
Yeah, and
She told me.
And she told you sometimes in the frontispiece of the novel, she would reveal the mystery, sometimes in the first sentence, sometimes in the title. She's just diabolical.
Yeah.
And it's not how many, it's not like there's a formula, it's how it's done.
Yeah, how
It's
skillful
how
you
it's
are
done.
at it.
It's how, and you can do anything if you set it up correctly, but not if you don't. And my husband and I we're the last two people on the planet to be watching Downton Abbey, I think. Everybody else has watched it. And oh my God, we were loving the show. We were really enjoying it a lot. And then we got to the end of season 3.
The only episode I ever saw.
Oh my God, and they broke a promise to the reader and they didn't set it up, and I was so mad, I was just ready to kill. And it's like, you cannot break promises to the reader. They could have easily set this up. They could have foreshadowed it. There are 1,000 ways to set it up. It turned out that the character wanted to leave the show, and then so they just kind of fixed it in the last chapter and dropped it in. You're like, what? But it broke every rule, because you can do anything if you set it up properly. And if you're good, like Agatha, you set it up so that it's right there in plain sight, but everybody's looking in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And she has, all you have to do, I would say, if you want to take an excellent writing course, read all of Agatha Christie's novels.
And while you're at it, read all of Dorothy Dunnett.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dame
yeah.
Dorothy Dunnett.
Yes, right. Yeah.
She has a series called The House of Nicola, in which you never know what's going
Right.
on. You know there's a villain who's messing with the hero for 7 volumes, and you think you know who that is.
And she's
And then in the
92
last
steps
volume,
ahead
you
of
find out, yeah, that guy was villainous, but he wasn't the real villain.
Yeah.
It's this guy. And you go, and I read that, no!
But you didn't
You
go.
deserved it, though.
But you didn't get
deserved-
mad because You got mad because you were stupid. You didn't get mad because they did it.
Well, I thought she was cheating, but I went back and checked.
She
and
wasn't.
It was
She
in the
wasn't.
first chapter of the first book.
Right, right.
Okay.
I mean, that's the thing. Your response should be, oh, of course, I should have seen that coming, and not, what? You know.
So I will add one thing that I think is a generally good piece of advice, especially if you're a new author, because I've talked to so many writers who have done this exact thing, probably not the erudite people on this panel, but that first book, there's a temptation to make it way more complicated
Right.
than it
Oh,
needs
yes,
to be.
absolutely.
Okay, good, I'm glad to hear you say that, because
Absolutely.
you just think, oh, it's not enough, I need to put in this and this. Keep it really simple, because you're learning on that book, and over time you will learn that you don't need that much stuff to tell the story.
And a well-executed formulaic piece is still going to land on the mark. It is actually very hard to do a simple shot and hit the target. Practice that before you start doing your trick shots and you're behind the back and all that kind of stuff. Because if you try to start with the trick shots, you're just gonna make a whole lot of holes in the wall. You're probably gonna hurt people.
That's right.
And there's nothing
You're not
wrong with
Annie Oakley
learning how to
here.
do a really good, if you're
Yeah.
gonna stick with the analogy, just
Yeah.
sink the ball every time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think every story has a promise,
Yes.
and you've got to keep that promise.
And you've got to figure out what the promise is.
Yeah.
Yes, what is
Or-
this story? Is that,
Or
what is it
alternatively,
about?
if you promise something and deliver another thing, that other thing has to be 3 times cooler than whatever you promised.
Absolutely, absolutely. Castle, the TV show Castle,
Yeah.
promised set 12 series, I can't remember how many seasons, 7 or 8 seasons of banter, charming, they're obviously going to get together, terribly romantic. They killed her. They killed her at the end.
Spoiler alert.
Well, no, because then the audience was so furious and the online just exploded because they broke this promise. You knew they were going to get together. That was what you were watching the show for. And then they realized it, and then they cobbled together a different ending where she almost died but didn't die. And they got together at the end, and you're like, oh, come on. And you would think that they could have seen that that was what they were supposed to do, that that's what they'd promised, but apparently not.
I think what happened there was that the two actors fought.
Yeah.
So they hated each other's guts.
Yeah, they would not be on set at the same time.
Right.
And I think that they wanted to try to continue with Castle alone.
Oh,
Right, yeah, they were setting
And
up
so
as a
they thought,
PI,
okay,
yeah.
let's just get rid of her so we can continue with Castle. And the viewers were like, hell no. No,
Yeah,
you
that's not
made
what we
this
were here for.
promise.
Yeah.
And you're, yeah.
Whereas when the red wedding happens, and I won't spoil it for people who don't necessarily know what it is, that's when it's breaking a promise you thought the author had made, but that you understand it's like, oh, the author actually promised me an actual political drama.
And the author will break promises too.
The author is going to show me how messy this horrific process is of, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But like you say, like Walter said, it has to be 3 times as good as,
Yeah.
as what you originally promised,
Yeah.
so.
Okay, next question.
You
Anyone?
over here.
I just wanted to, you talked about the red wedding. Doesn't that kind of like go in with like also the world building?
Yeah.
Like it kind of sets up the fact that you don't know what's gonna come. They literally kill Ned Stark in the first season, and you're like,
Right.
that is insane. You know, like, I know, spoilers, but you know, it's like, that immediately sets up like you don't know what
Right.
Yes.
what's a promise.
Oh,
and
this
what's
is
not.
that kind of world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
although I
Oh,
will
dear.
argue that it's not saying that there are no promises. It's like, you thought I was one thing and I'm
Right.
not. You know, you
Yeah.
date the person and you think that they're, you know, that they love their job or whatever, but they actually want to do something way cooler with their life. You know, that kind of thing. That's, you know, so that moment of breaking the promise needs to come with all kinds of reassurance of, it's not that I don't know what I'm doing. I am going to take you in a totally different direction than you thought you were going to go.
Yeah, I would argue, and again, spoiler on this, but I knew when I read that book, when the dire wolf was killed, it was like, oh.
Yeah, they always foreshadow.
This is the playing field we are on. This is what this author is going to do to me.
Right. Well, and some people would argue that the very first scene with the throwing somebody out the
Out the window.
yes,
Yeah.
child out the window, would kind of give you a clue.
It was
that this
the
is
dog,
not-
Connie.
I'm sorry, the dog. No, it was the dog. They killed the dog. You're actually right. That's one of my biggest rules for writing is never kill the dog.
You need to know who your puppy is.
And then
can
the
throw a kid
second
out the
rule
window.
is figure out who the dog is.
Yes.
Don't kill them.
And also, when you throw the kid out the window, he can't land on the dog.
That's right. That is really important. Yeah.
But I would argue that part of why The Walking Dead lost steam for a while there was they killed their puppy. They didn't recognize who their puppy was.
Yeah.
And when they killed him, it was like and it didn't, yes, you've killed a lot of people, but there was something fundamentally wrong
Yeah.
with you killing this person.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Agreed.
So I have a funny thing about like being called out by readers on stuff. This hadn't happened to me ever before, but in this series that I'm working on right now, My Dark Wizard World, I created a fairly elaborate world to torture my protagonists. But so I have this thing going on where they're like trying to rebuild this house, and they're sort of attracting all of these renegades and people who don't fit in different places, and they're under crushing debt, and they're trying to build this community and also rebuild the finances of the house. Well, I got this message from a reader the other day where she said, can you give me more information on what Nick is doing in order to rebuild the finances of the house, because I want to create a community like this.
What?
And I'm trying to figure out how to structure it financially.
You're like,
I am not
first you
writing
need this magical
manuals.
system. Yeah.
This is not a manual, this is a novel.
It's a novel, and that's why I say, you do understand this is fiction.
Wow, that's different. I've never heard that
Right?
criticism. Wow. Wow. Well, there is nothing that will surprise you more than the things you hear from your readers.
True.
And some of it can be wonderfully surprising. It's just
Yes.
like, sometimes when you didn't really even understand why you wrote a thing a certain way, somebody will come to you and say something and it'll make sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
You now understand it perfectly.
We'll go out and build those worlds. Well, we still got time. 5 more minutes, or do we go up to the hour?
We go up to the hour, actually.
You go,
Okay, yeah. Can I talk a little bit about the telling detail?
there's a
I'm sorry, there's a question. Go ahead. Go ahead. Okay. Well, the telling detail, I think,
This is good. This
is really important too. There are details, all kinds of details, but there are certain details that mean more than you would think.
Yes.
And if you can figure out a telling detail, then that really can do an enormous amount of work in your world building. There is no need to tell every single thing about the world, but if you can find a few telling details, like for instance, in Doomsday Book, I was reading all about medieval England and the Black Death and all these things, and I had zillions of details to choose from. But some were more resonant than others, and the one that really struck me was when I found out that the plague in England did not come from Europe, as you might think, straight across the Channel. Instead, it came south and over to Portsmouth, and then came kind of southeast toward London. And as it moved across country, there was no communication, and most people never traveled more than 20 miles from where they were born. But you could hear the bells of the town, which were a bell was sort of an all-purpose communication device. You used bells to call people to church in the morning and to vespers in the evening, to tell people to come in from the fields. If there was a child lost, you rang the bells all night so they could find their way home, things like that. And they also rang, of course, funerals. And so they started hearing, and you would hear in your village that they were ringing a funeral. They would do 9 tailors for a man, 3 for a woman, 1 for a child, followed by a solid hour of ringing. And so you would hear this, what was obviously a funeral, in this village off to the northwest. And then the next day, 3 funerals. And then the next day, nonstop ringing. And then silence. But meanwhile, this village and this village and this village were starting to ring funerals. And you knew something terrible was coming, and you had no idea what, and you had no way to stop it. And when I read that, I went, oh my God, this is the symbol of the plague. This is what the Black Death was really, really like. And it was worth more than 1,000 details about what the buboes were like, what the fevers were like, what people did.
Statistics.
The statistics,
Yeah.
yeah. This was what, to me, really, and maybe it just captured it for me, but it was once I found that, this is my telling detail, and this is going to hold the whole story together. And once I had it then, I started sprinkling bells into every aspect of the novel that I could think of.
Bell ringer
Crazy
people,
bell ringers
yes.
in the present.
Yes.
And then a discussion of the bells, who was ringing the bells in this particular village, and as many bells as I could get in there, because that I knew was going to form the basic, it was going to be the telling detail of the novel.
And part of what Connie just said is really important in that she went back and layered it in.
Right.
You don't have to have it figured out at the beginning.
Right.
Once you figure it out, you can go back and put it in. And, because we really get into this groove as readers of thinking that it's all sequential, but as writers, we go back and do things. I have a friend who did a series that she had this great telling detail where she had a little Gumby figure in her car attached to the dashboard. And when she would get in her car, she would move the Gumby's arms and head and stuff to make it reflect like whatever mood she was in. And it was a cute little detail, yeah, and it was this kind of thing. And so like at the end of the second book in this trilogy, she has had her memory maliciously erased and made her believe that she's with someone different than who she wanted to be with. And at the beginning of the third book, she's like going along and you're so frustrated because you're thinking, no, you've been brainwashed, you don't really believe this. But she gets in her car and the mood of the Gumby is totally different than what she had been told had happened. And that begins the disconnect. And it is such a brilliant little detail, because for 2 books, you're just like, oh, isn't that cute? And then later it's like, boom.
And she didn't do that. She put in that scene and then went back and
And then she went, and I know, because she was a friend, I knew she went, and once she figured it out, she's like, oh. And so she just sprinkled it in.
Right.
Fun.
Yeah.
Right.
That's cool.
So, we have a question?
Let's go with your question, sir.
I was wondering, have you ever cut out a part of your world and then, I guess, have you ever cut out a part of the world that it just didn't vibe well?
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
And then, but have you tried to incorporate that either in the same story or somewhere else? Like, what was that?
There have been a couple instances where I cut subplots out of a novel and then turned them into short fiction. They were too long or something. They didn't fit the novel quite well. They were too long. They were just slightly off in terms of tone or something. But they were perfectly fine on their own.
What were you good? You had one.
I had to cut a subplot once because I have a lot of layers. I'm one of those that, like, when I first started, I just had so much going on, so many layers. And there was one book in particular where my editor's like, okay, this is just too much. This is yet another mystery. And I had like 7 mysteries up to that point. And like the big one and then the little ones, And she said, had me cut this one. Well, and then I ended up using it like 3 books later. So yeah. Absolutely.
But even if you're not going to use it, cut it out anyway,
Yeah,
because
right,
it doesn't
right.
belong there. And that's really hard. It's really hard to have written stuff and then realize, oh, this is great, but I can't use it. When I was writing Blackout in All Clear, which is set during World War II, I had this great scene that was set, one of the historians was going to be at Pearl Harbor the night before, because there's all this great detail about what happened at Pearl Harbor the night before. And one of the things was that General Short and his wife and another couple were driving over to the club dance, and they drove along Battleship Row, and one of the wives said, look at all those battleships lit up. That would make a terrific target.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, this is so good. I've got to put this in here. And it was, except that the problem was if I put somebody at Pearl Harbor, then I couldn't use them anywhere else, because then they'd have a deadline. In my time travel, you can't be in the same place twice, or same time twice. So then I'd have to, December of 1941, my poor character would be toast. And so it was just, well, that won't work. And I had written all of it. I actually had it in really final form. It was some of the best stuff in the whole book. But it had to go. It had to go, and you have to be really ruthless, realizing that it has to go.
But can you reuse it?
No, I couldn't reuse that, but I told the story, which is a great story. Is that not a great story?
But in terms of world building, have you changed things about the world? I think it's very important to be honest with ourselves about things we might have been saying with our world that are not the greatest things that we, know about ourselves. It's just like, was there a disposable race of people? Was there somebody who was always invisible in the room? And did I never address the fact that, did I just let that, I always think of things like, I'm Asian American, I'm Chinese on my father's side, and, with the controversy around licorice pizza, at first, I heard that there was this offensive running gag about mispronouncing Asian names. I thought, yeah, I don't love that, but I don't care. But it was a response that it was like, oh dang, you need to be more honest with yourselves. Because they said, you can't expect us to change the past, or, and as if it would have been work to not cast that, write that, light it, all of that. Film is a very expensive medium. And it's a matter of being honest with yourself about, that's when I've kind of been like, oh, I need to change this world, because it is revealing a part of me that I'm not comfortable with, I need to change. And oftentimes, if it comes back later, it's me addressing, like, let's run this again with a little bit more awareness and some actual consequences for this thought.
I'm actually gonna go with Amber.
She had her hand up for a bit.
So if you have, because I was told once if it's sci-fi, the reader needs to know that almost immediately, that when they're reading it, they can tell. But what if the world the characters are in, they don't realize, like, if they think they're in the 1950s, but really they're not, how soon does the reader need to know that there's a sci-fi element without it being jarring?
Pern, it's not until like the end of the series.
Right.
Pern is like a fantasy series.
Right,
And
it's
and
fantasy
Anne
series.
McCaffrey's like, no, it's
No,
science
it's not.
fiction.
It's
It's like,
science fiction.
sorry,
Yeah.
but,
Right.
yeah.
For someone who's like not established, how soon?
She wasn't established. No, but Pern was her break.
No,
was her.
I think it's actually a valid question.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
the
Because you don't want them to be like, if you wait too long and then they're like, well, this is jarring, but if you reveal it too soon, then that's kind of.
Well, I think Connie was.
I was going to say, first of all, you need to read Friday by Robert Heinlein, and then you need to read, well, I don't care which order, Bring the Jubilee by Ward Moore.
Okay.
Both of which are books in which you think you're in one world and then you're not. And that you find that out gradually. Okay, so you always can learn to write best by reading somebody who's done it correctly.
That's
so
great
those
advice.
are two good things. But also, Steve Martin, the comedian, says, you need to establish the parameters of a movie within 5 minutes of that movie. Not necessarily the exact world you're in, but like, if things are gonna happen that are magical, then something magical needs to happen in the first 5 minutes. Otherwise, they're gonna think this is a movie about modern day LA. And they're really gonna be, what? Where did that magic thing come from? So in some way, you need to establish just the parameters, not necessarily the whole world, but
Not even necessarily the genre.
right, or not the genre.
Yeah,
but
because
just-
it might be
just-
unexplained.
Right,
Yeah.
but just the parameters. So like in the first 5 minutes of Steve
Sci-fi
Martin's,
Dark Academia, then you would see that they're in a school, so that's the Dark Academia part.
right,
But the
right,
sci-fi can come
right.
later.
But you need to not, the reader should not be brought down with a thunk at any point during the story. So if I'm reading along quite happily, and this is a story about modern day LA, and the rules of modern day LA will apply, and then suddenly there are flying cars, or suddenly there's a talking signpost, which is what there is in LA Story. He doesn't show you that talking signpost in the first 5 minutes of that movie, but he talks about miracles that changed his life.
There's a sense of the magical realism
from the very beginning.
From the beginning.
Yeah, from the beginning, so that when you see that the signpost is talking to him, the highway signpost is talking to him, then you're not like, wait, what? Where am I? Kind of thing. That's what you want to avoid, is the thunk, unless you intend it. Because like when you get the thunk in Bring the Jubilee, in which you think you're in the modern world, that, you're assuming that you're in reality, and then you're like, shit, this is a reality in which the South won the Civil War. Oh my God. And that doesn't come to like, I think 50 pages in to bring the Jubilee. And then you're just, but he wants you to feel that. So if you want the reader to feel that thunk, then okay. But if not, you need to give them every help they can. The reader has nothing but the text to go by. You, on the other hand, know what you intended, what you planned, what's going to happen, but they don't have anything. So you've got to help them a lot.
And it would depend on your intentions for the story.
Right.
So like, what was the movie that we just watched?
Don't worry, darling.
What was it?
Don't worry, darling.
Don't Worry, Darling, where it's foreshadowed that something's going on. You think you're in the 50s.
You know there's something's weird
But you
from the
know
beginning.
something's weird, yeah. And so it would depend. Do you want that foreshadowing or do you want that thunk?
And I think it comes back to what we talked about earlier is don't try to do your trick shots before you learn how to
Right.
actually sink the ball in the basket. So
Right.
I had a conversation recently with a brand new writer and I was giving her advice on it. And she was like her protagonist, or one of, her romantic hero was an incubus. And she was going to all of these contortions to avoid identifying him as an incubus. And I said, well, does the story depend on that being a surprise? And she was like, well, no. It's like, so then
Tell
stop.
them.
Just tell them. Just come right out and say it.
Yes, nothing should be a secret unless you mean it to be a secret.
Right, and then there's got to be that payoff.
And then you want that big
Yeah,
reveal.
one example I can think of is Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go.
Yes.
Which is a science fiction novel by a literary novelist, right? And
Who says he
and so
doesn't
I was
write
reading, I
science
had
fiction?
probably an atypical reaction for his readership. Because I'm a science fiction writer, and I was seeing that he was setting up something about how this world was different, right? And I began realizing it's in the form of a memoir of this young girl's enchanted days at an enchanted boarding school, right? And then, I noticed, well, the teachers aren't called teachers, they're called guardians. I don't know of any boarding schools that do that, but then I'm not British, so what do I, but there were, and basically I began to realize, okay, these kids are being raised for spare parts. Okay, their destiny is they're gonna be cut up for spare parts. And
So it's a happy
I was thinking, do I know this because I'm a science fiction writer, or is he going to save this for the big reveal at the end? And fortunately, he didn't. The big reveal happened about 100 pages in, and the rest of it was both the reader and the characters coping with
The reality.
their
Because the reader
future.
finds out when the characters do.
Right.
Yeah, if they haven't worked it out ahead of time, being a
Yeah.
superior reader like myself.
Well, I worked it out too, Walter.
No, any of us would, because
Yes.
we know to look for
Because
those
you can see
things.
them,
So,
yeah.
And don't paint yourself into corners, and people said don't add details that you don't have to, but the most common rookie mistake is not giving enough information. The best suspense is built by all the information except for that one key piece, but it's having more information that builds the suspense. It's like, no, something is not right,
Yeah, tell the readers what's at stake.
But if you don't tell them anything, it's like, they're not gonna care, they're not gonna try to
That's right.
figure it out,
That's right.
delicate.
Do we have time?
Yeah, we have time.
Okay, so my question is, do you tend to world build as you write, or do you find it easier to create a second, just start by creating a document where you're building a world or describing, or even write a short story or something to get started with it?
Everybody has a different approach, everybody. And you can only speak for yourself and figure out what works for you. And that's true of every aspect of writing. Don't ever think there's a way to do it as opposed to not.
I have used
But-
all of those methods.
Right. But for me, I don't world build anything ahead of time. I world build it as I am going because I don't want to world build this entire thing over in Europe if I'm not going to need it. I have enough
I'm
trouble getting
saying,
everything
yeah.
done,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, I tend to have a fairly good outline of what my worlds are like, but the other thing is that your characters are discovering this world along with the reader, and so you have to be open to allowing discoveries to happen and to allowing your ideas to be changed a little because of the reaction of the character to the environment.
But if nobody's going to get sick, you don't need to figure out the entire hospital system at this point.
I think there's a temptation to use world building as displacement activity.
Yes, I,
And so the important thing is to remember, go ahead and do your world building ahead of time, but it doesn't count as writing. You are not writing your book, you are world building.
I have one precautionary tale, though. If you expect a big map if you write the kind of fantasy that's going to have a map at the beginning, draw the stinking map. Apparently, my friend found this out the hard way. Daniel Abraham, who also writes as James S.A. Corey and Emma in Hanover. His very first sale was one of these big fantasy books, and they were like, "Where's your map?" And he's like, "I don't have a map." And they're like, "You need to make a map." And so he spent all of WorldCon, which is a 5-day con, rereading everything and being like, "Oh, there's a road between this city and this city. I wonder where those are." You know?
Maybe draw the map as you go.
Yeah.
I did my map after, because they did the same thing to me. They said, "Where's your map?" But fortunately, I had it in my head.
Yeah. So if you're not a visual person, draw your map.
Stop with your brain.
Yeah. Whatever.
Because I keep it.
Yeah, I've only written one series that requires a map at the beginning, so, and I sort of drew it along as I was working on it. But I have a space opera series where there's a civilization put together by wormhole gates, which means that you don't go straight from one place to another. You go into a wormhole, and the wormhole can take you anywhere in place and time, basically. Although this particular wormhole will take you here and at this time, right? So I get questions for, can I have a map of that? No. I have a map, but you haven't seen all of this map, and I'm not going to show you the places that I'm not showing you yet, because I'm allowing the opportunity to change all that.
right.
Okay, it's about 6 minutes to the next panel.
Okay.
So let's thank our authors.
Thank you. I do not have another panel until, so I'm gonna go eat some cookies.
Thank you, moderator.
Good idea. Good plan. I hate these chairs. They're stupid chairs.
Walter, what was the Dorothy Dunnett? House of...